There's a moment in every woman's life when silence becomes heavier than truth. For Margaret Hayes, it came over roast beef and polite smiles. One sentence, sharp, casual, and cruel, shattered decades of quiet sacrifice. You can have what the cat leaves. Laughter rippled, but it wasn't warm. It stung. In that instant, Margaret saw every year she'd poured into her son's family. Every bill paid, every sleepless night babysitting, every holiday spent alone so they could vacation, turned to dust. She could swallow it like always, or she could do something that would make them remember this dinner forever. Her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't rise. But the choice she made would ripple far beyond that table, setting off a chain of events no one in the Hayes family would see coming. And no one could stop. Margaret Hayes sat at the long oak table she had polished herself 100 times before, the scent of roast beef, garlic potatoes, and buttered carrots curling in the warm air. Across from her, Nicole carved her meat with precise, almost delicate strokes, the sharp glint of the knife catching the light. Stephen poured himself another glass of wine without meeting his mother's eyes. Emily, sweet Emily, sat hunched at the far end of the table, quietly pushing peas around her plate. It was the kind of Sunday dinner Margaret used to look forward to. She had cooked meals like this for decades, back when Stephen was a boy, and they would sit shoulder to shoulder in the small kitchen of their old house, laughing over little nothings. But tonight, she was only a guest. Nicole had taken over Sunday dinners years ago, insisting it was easier that way. Easier, Margaret suspected, because it allowed her to control every detail, the menu, the seating, even the conversation. The talk had been light but hollow. Stephen's work deadlines, Emily's upcoming exams, the weather. Then Nicole set down her knife and fork, dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, and smiled. That taut, controlled smile Margaret had come to dread. "You can have what the cat leaves," she said, her tone casual, almost sing-song. For a heartbeat, the words didn't register. Then they sank in, cold and sharp. A small chuckle rippled from Stephen, quickly smothered. Nicole's sister, Patricia, visiting from out of town, let out a short laugh before sipping her wine. Even Emily's fork paused mid-air, her eyes flicking from her mother to her grandmother. Margaret's hand tightened on her own fork. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down. The old habit rising in her chest, that familiar instinct to swallow the sting, to pretend it hadn't landed. She had done it so many times before. But tonight, something in her shifted. She set her fork down slowly, deliberately. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice steady. Then she reached across the table with a calmness that made the air feel heavier. Nicole blinked, uncertain, as Margaret's fingers closed around the untouched half of her steak. No one spoke. The scrape of the plate was the only sound as Margaret stood, the meat balanced neatly in her hand. She walked past the counter, past the sideboard, to the corner of the room where a plump tabby cat named Oliver lounged in his bed. Oliver lifted his head, green eyes curious. Margaret crouched, placed the steak gently into the cat's dish, and watched him sniff it once before tearing in with relish. The sound of his chewing filled the silence like a drumbeat. She straightened, smoothed her skirt, and walked back to her seat without a glance at Nicole. When she picked up her water glass, the room was frozen. Nicole's cheeks burned crimson. Stephen stared down at his plate. Patricia cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. Only Emily's eyes met Margaret's, wide with something that looked almost like awe. "Well," Margaret said, her tone as mild as if they'd been discussing the weather, "I suppose now we'll both see how much he leaves me." Somewhere down the table, Emily made a sound, half laugh, half cough, and quickly ducked her head. Nicole's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "That was a joke," she said finally, her voice brittle. "You know, humor?" "I know," Margaret replied, spearing a carrot. "So was mine." The rest of the meal passed in uneasy quiet. Knives scraped plates, glasses clinked. Oliver purred under the table, still licking his chops. Margaret ate without hurry, letting the stillness settle around her like a heavy quilt. She didn't look at Nicole, and she didn't need to. The message had been sent. When dinner ended, Nicole busied herself stacking plates with stiff, jerky movements. Stephen carried a few to the kitchen, muttering something Margaret couldn't catch. Emily lingered, as if reluctant to break the invisible line now drawn across the table. Margaret rose, smoothing her sweater. She felt oddly calm, not triumphant, but settled, as though she had just stepped over a threshold she hadn't even realized she'd been standing at for years. In the kitchen, she ran warm water over her hands, the scent of dish soap mingling with roast beef. Through the window above the sink, she could see Stephen loading the dishwasher, his movements mechanical, while Nicole dried dishes without looking at him. Emily appeared in the doorway, her hair falling loose over her shoulders now. She waited until Margaret turned before stepping closer. "Grandma," she said softly, "that was the best thing I've ever seen you do." Margaret lifted an eyebrow. "Feeding the cat?" Emily grinned, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Feeding the cat her dinner. You should have seen her face." Margaret chuckled low in her throat, though she kept it brief. "Sometimes," she said, "you have to speak a language people understand." Emily's smile softened into something warmer. "They shouldn't talk to you like that." Margaret met her gaze, feeling a small knot loosen somewhere deep inside. "No," she said quietly, "they shouldn't." The air in the dining room felt heavier than the roast beef scent hanging in it. Nicole busied herself with plates, but her movements had an edge, each clink of ceramic a little too sharp. Stephen avoided Margaret's gaze, sipping his wine like it might shield him from the tension. Only Emily seemed unbothered, leaning back in her chair, eyes flicking between the adults with quiet calculation. Margaret knew the comment had landed exactly as Nicole intended. It wasn't humor. It was a tiny blade slipped neatly between the ribs, and that made her next move all the sweeter. Not only had she fed the cat half of Nicole's steak, she'd done it with a line that would echo in the room for years. The look on Nicole's face, part shock, part fury, had been worth every ounce of restraint Margaret had exercised over the past decade. But as she reached for her water glass, she caught Stephen watching her. His eyes weren't angry so much as wary, like a man assessing a sudden shift in the ground beneath him. That wariness was almost worse than open anger. Margaret could read him well enough to know that it wasn't just about dinner. It was about control. And tonight, she'd upset a balance they'd been comfortable with for far too long. The scrape of Oliver's dish punctuated the silence. Nicole shot a glance toward the cat as if blaming him for the humiliation. Margaret caught it and nearly smiled, but then Stephen's gaze hardened just a fraction. He leaned slightly toward Nicole, whispering something too low for Margaret to catch, and Nicole's lips pressed into a thin line. Before the tension could snap, Emily piped up, her voice bright and casual. "So, Mom," she said, "are we still going to that art show next weekend? The one downtown?" Her tone was airy, but the timing was surgical. Every head turned toward her, the invisible spotlight shifting away from Margaret. Nicole hesitated, caught off guard. Yes, I suppose," she replied, her voice a notch softer. Emily pressed on, asking about tickets, parking, and whether her friend Mia could come along. It was enough to redirect the flow of conversation, though the undercurrent of unease still hummed beneath it. Margaret watched her granddaughter work with quiet admiration. Emily wasn't just making small talk, she was creating cover. Whether she realized it or not, she was pulling the attention away from the moment Nicole would have liked to turn into an attack. It was a small act of loyalty, subtle but sharp. When the plates were cleared and dessert, store-bought pie was served, the conversation never quite found its rhythm again. Every word felt like it was balanced on a thin edge. Margaret ate slowly, her fork cutting neat lines into the crust, letting the quiet stretch. By the time she stood to leave, Nicole had retreated into polite civility, her smile mechanical. Stephen walked her to the door, hands shoved into his pockets. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, the words flat and perfunctory. Margaret studied his face, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the stiffness in his jaw. "Good night, Stephen," she replied simply, stepping past him into the cool evening air. The night smelled faintly of wood smoke, the chill settling into her bones in a way that was almost pleasant. As she walked to her car, she replayed the evening in her mind, not the insult, but her response. The old Margaret would have smiled politely, maybe laughed along and gone home with a knot in her chest, but that woman was gone. Something had shifted tonight, something permanent. She slid into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel, feeling the smooth leather under her fingers. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was retreating from a battle she hadn't chosen. She felt like she'd taken the first swing. The street was quiet as she pulled away, the haze warm-lit windows shrinking in her rear-view mirror. She thought of Emily, of the quick way her granddaughter had stepped in, and a small, fierce pride bloomed in her chest. There was more strength in that girl than Margaret had dared hope. By the time she turned onto her own street, the decision was made. This wasn't going to be another story she filed away under things better left unsaid. No. This was the start of something else entirely. She would no longer be the safety net everyone assumed was theirs to use. She would no longer measure her worth in favors granted or money spent. Margaret parked in her driveway and sat for a moment, letting the engine's soft ticking fill the quiet. In her mind, she could still hear Nicole's voice, light and mocking. It didn't sting now, it sharpened her focus. She stepped out of the car, locked the door behind her, and walked inside. Her home greeted her with the familiar scent of lavender polish and the faint creak of old floorboards. She hung her coat, turned on the lamp in the living room, and sank into her favorite chair. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sound settle her. Tomorrow, she thought, the real work begins. Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow of the street lamp outside tracing faint lines across the plaster. Sleep had eluded her since she'd returned home. Every time she closed her eyes, Nicole's voice came back, light, almost sing-song, but with that razor hidden inside. "You can have what the cat leaves." The words had been delivered over roast beef, but their weight lingered like lead. She turned onto her side, then back again. Rest wouldn't come. Finally, with a sigh, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and reached for her robe. The hallway was cool, the kind of quiet that makes the hum of the refrigerator sound louder. She padded into the kitchen, switched on the light, and stood there for a moment, her hands curled around the edge of the counter. There was something she had been avoiding for years, not because she didn't know it existed, but because she knew exactly what it would show her. Tonight, that avoidance felt cowardly. Tonight, she was done pretending. She crossed to the drawer beside the fridge, the one that held her important papers. Neatly labeled folders sat in rows, each one a chapter of her life. Insurance, property deeds, bank statements. And then, there it was. The blue folder marked Family Assistance. She carried it to the table, sat down, and opened it. Receipts, photocopies of checks, transfer confirmations, years of them, arranged in tidy stacks. Her pen hovered over a yellow legal pad as she began to list them out. $15,000. Stephen's car loan when his old sedan died. $8,000. Nicole's online business course. $3,200. Private school tuition for Emily's first year. $2,700. Summer camp for both kids. $5,500. New washer and dryer when theirs broke right before Christmas. $4,800. Mortgage payments during Stephen's temporary job loss. Vacation, emergencies, medical bills, credit card payoffs. The list grew, line after line, until the neat yellow page was nearly full. Margaret paused, tapping the pen against the paper. She picked up her calculator and began adding. The numbers clicked softly in the stillness. By the time she reached the last figure, the total glared up at her. $76,450. She set the calculator down, her breath leaving in a slow, deliberate exhale. $76,450. And that was just what she'd tracked. There were dinners paid for, groceries bought, and countless hours of babysitting she could never put a price on. The number wasn't just money, it was years of her life, chipped away one small favor at a time. Her mind drifted back to the early years after Stephen married Nicole. She'd told herself she was helping them get started, smoothing the bumps so they could focus on building their lives. When the first loan wasn't paid back, she told herself it didn't matter. Family didn't keep score. But here it was, the score written in her own hand, and it told a story she couldn't unsee. Margaret leaned back in her chair, staring at the columns of figures. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was the complete absence of acknowledgement. No thank yous that lasted beyond the moment. No offers to help her in return. No sense that they saw her as anything other than a bottomless well to draw from. And then, after all that, to be told she could have what the cat leaves? It was almost laughable, if it didn't sting so deep. She closed the folder and placed it in the center of the table. Her decision began to take shape, sharp and clear. She would not keep feeding this cycle. Not another dollar, not another just this once, not another rescue from consequences they'd brought on themselves. The support would end here now. It wasn't about punishment. She told herself that more than once as she sat there. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the space in her life where gratitude and respect should have lived. If she wanted her final years to be her own, she needed to draw a line so bright and so firm that no one could pretend it didn't exist. Margaret rose and went to the kitchen counter where her bank's number was scribbled on a notepad. She ran her fingers over the digits, memorizing them. Tomorrow she would call. Tomorrow she would cancel every automatic transfer and remove Stephen's access to her savings. And tomorrow she would begin the process of making sure that when she was gone, the bulk of what she had left would go to someone who truly cared, someone like Emily. For now, though, she slid the folder back into its place, turned off the light, and stood in the doorway of her kitchen for a long moment. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the leaves scraping against one another like whispers. She could almost hear George's voice, low and steady, telling her it was all right to take care of herself first. Margaret tightened the belt of her robe and walked back toward her bedroom. She wasn't sure what the next days would bring, but one thing was certain. The rules had just changed, and she was the one who had changed them. Margaret reopened the blue folder the next morning, the pale winter light spilling across the kitchen table. She wanted to see everything again, line by line, as if rereading the evidence would make her resolve stronger. Her fingers moved through the stack with mechanical precision, but her eyes caught details she'd skimmed over in the restless haze of the night before. Wanting $200. Supposedly for Emily's school trip to Washington, D.C. She frowned. That was the same spring Emily had told her she couldn't go because her parents didn't have the money. So where had the funds gone? $3,500. A roof repair Stephen had insisted was urgent. Yet Margaret remembered being at their house 2 weeks later and seeing a brand new gas grill on the back patio. $2,000, labeled car repairs, but the receipt was from an electronics store. A cold, sharp weight settled in her chest. This wasn't just thoughtless dependency. It was deception. They hadn't just used her generosity. They'd treated it as a resource to be mined, bending the truth to make sure the mine never ran dry. She set the papers down and rubbed her temples, her mind running back through years of easy lies. The vague emergencies, the urgent phone calls, the vague promises to pay it back when things get better. She had wanted to believe them. Perhaps she had needed to. The doorbell rang, breaking the spiral. When she opened it, Carolyn stood on the porch, bundled in her wool coat, cheeks pink from the cold. "Just passing through the neighborhood," Carolyn said, stepping inside with the ease of a friendship that had lasted decades. Margaret put on tea, grateful for the company. Over steaming mugs, Carolyn began telling her about an old friend, Rita, who had finally cut the cord with her grown son after years of quietly funding his lifestyle. She said it was like getting her life back, Carolyn chuckled. The poor boy had to get a job that actually paid the bills. Imagine that. Margaret found herself smiling, not out of malice, but at the thought of someone else breaking free. Carolyn's story felt like a hand on her back, steadying her, pushing her forward. Maybe it wasn't selfish to say no. Maybe it was survival. They talked for an hour, the conversation drifting between neighborhood gossip and old memories, but that little spark stayed alive inside Margaret. She walked Carolyn to the door, hugged her goodbye, and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, her mind already turning over possibilities. For a moment, though, doubt crept in. She imagined Stephen's face, the disappointment, the guilt trips that would follow. She pictured Nicole's sharpened words, designed to make her feel petty and unloving. Maybe, she thought, it would be easier to just stop giving money and leave it at that. No confrontations, no drama. But as she gathered the scattered receipts from the table, another thought rose to meet it. Emily. She remembered her granddaughter's small, conspiratorial smile the night of the dinner, the way she had deflected the tension when it threatened to boil over. That girl had more kindness and more grit than her parents seemed to realize. And if Margaret was going to reclaim her resources, maybe it was time to put them where they would matter most. The idea formed quickly, cleanly. She would cut Stephen and Nicole off completely, and she would open a separate account for Emily, one they could not touch, a nest egg that would be hers alone when she was ready to use it, for college or for whatever path she chose. Margaret would keep it quiet between the two of them. This wasn't about revenge. It was about shifting her support to someone who valued it and who valued her. Margaret gathered the papers back into the folder, her earlier heaviness replaced with a strange, quiet energy. The blue folder no longer looked like a record of loss. It looked like the starting point of a plan. She reached for the notepad where her bank's number still sat in bold black ink. Tomorrow, she thought, she'd walk into the branch herself. She'd sit across from a personal banker and take back the keys she'd handed over too freely. And when she walked out, she'd have not just her money, but her self-respect intact. For the first time since that dinner, Margaret felt the corners of her mouth lift into a true smile. The next morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight spilling through the kitchen curtains in sharp bands. Margaret dressed with quiet deliberation, navy slacks, a pressed blouse, and the sensible leather shoes she hadn't worn in years. The clothes made her feel grounded, like she was walking into an important meeting rather than just another errand. At exactly 9 o'clock, she stepped into the lobby of the small brick bank she'd used for decades. The same teller's counter she'd stood at with George when they'd opened their first joint account, still stretched across the front of the room. But now there was a glassed-in row of offices along the side for private consultations. A young man in a suit greeted her with a practiced smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes. How can we help you today?" "I'd like to speak to a personal banker," she said. "It's about my accounts." Within minutes, she was seated in a small office across from a woman named Valerie, whose tidy bun and calm demeanor radiated efficiency. "What can I do for you?" Valerie asked, fingers poised over her keyboard. Margaret placed the blue folder on the desk between them. "I want to cancel all automatic transfers to my son Stephen's account," she said, her voice steady, "and I want to revoke any joint access he has to my savings." Valerie's eyebrows flicked up slightly. "All transfers?" "Yes, every single one, and I'd like the access removed today if possible." There was no hesitation in her tone, no softening of the words to make them easier to swallow. Valerie nodded, scanning the documents Margaret had brought. "We'll need a few signatures, and I'll verify the accounts with linked permissions." They went through them one by one. Mortgage assistance, car insurance, credit card balances. Each line Margaret signed felt like another link in a chain breaking loose. The pen moved smoothly in her hand, the ink dark and decisive against the paper. When they were done, Valerie slid the confirmation sheets across the desk. The transfers are canceled and Stephen's access has been removed. There may be 1 or 2 payments already in process, but nothing else will go out after today. Margaret slipped the papers into her folder, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Thank you," she said. Then she took a breath and added, "I'd also like to open a new account, a trust account in my granddaughter Emily's name. I'll be the trustee until she turns 25. Valerie's smile warmed. "That's a wonderful idea." For the next 30 minutes, they arranged the account, setting it up so that the funds would be protected from any outside claims. Margaret transferred a considerable sum, enough to cover Emily's education and give her a head start in life. When they were finished, Valerie handed her the paperwork for safekeeping. As Margaret stepped back into the cold morning air, she felt the shift settle into her bones. This was the first financial decision she'd made in years that was entirely for herself, or for someone she truly wanted to help. Her phone buzzed in her bag before she'd even reached the corner. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Still, she checked the screen. Stephen. She let it ring. 10 seconds later, it buzzed again. This time, a text followed. "Mom, the bank says there's a problem with the transfers. Call me ASAP." Margaret slipped the phone back into her bag and kept walking toward the bus stop. Let him figure it out. By the time she reached home, there were 4 missed calls from Stephen and 2 from Nicole. She set the phone face down on the counter and made herself lunch, soup and toast, and ate in peace for the first time in weeks. The phone buzzed again. She didn't move. It was almost strange how easy it was once she'd decided. For years, she had felt like answering Stephen's calls was a duty she couldn't refuse, no matter how small the request or how inconvenient the timing. Now, each ignored ring felt like reclaiming a little more of her life. She washed her dishes, dried them, and returned to her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches, and a thin veil of clouds drifted over the sun. Margaret sipped her tea and thought of Emily. How surprised she'd be someday when she learned what her grandmother had done. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Margaret pushed open the glass door of the bank, the warmth inside immediately softening the February chill that clung to her coat. Her shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, the quiet hum of printers and low conversation filling the air. To anyone watching, she looked like any other customer running an errand, but she felt the tension of a diver standing on the edge of the board, ready to leap into cold water. A receptionist greeted her and ushered her toward a private office. Valerie, the banker from her last visit years ago, rose to shake her hand. "Mrs. Hayes," she said warmly, "what can we do for you today?" Margaret set the blue folder on the desk, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. "I need to cancel all automatic transfers to my son's account," she said evenly. "Every single one." Valerie's brows lifted, though her professional smile remained. "All of them?" Margaret opened the folder, sliding a neatly typed list across the desk. "Mortgage payments, credit cards, insurance, tuition, everything. And I need any joint access he has to my accounts removed." Valerie's eyes moved down the page, and though she didn't comment, the quick flick of her gaze back to Margaret told her she understood the scope. It wasn't a few forgotten subscriptions. It was a lifeline being cut. They went through each account, Margaret signing form after form, initials precise and steady. Each stroke of the pen was like severing one more tie to the years of quiet obligation she had carried. When the last confirmation sheet was printed and slid across the desk, Valerie hesitated. "Is there any particular reason for ending all of this at once?" Margaret allowed herself the faintest smile. "Let's just say I've decided to retire from being the family bank." Valerie nodded, the flicker of understanding in her eyes saying more than any words could. "Well," she said, "that's all set. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss?" "Yes." Margaret leaned forward. "I'd like to open a trust account in my granddaughter Emily's name, but I want a few specific conditions." Valerie folded her hands, listening. "I'll be the sole trustee until she turns 25. The funds are to be protected against any external claims, especially from family. No co-signers, no joint access, and no way for it to be tapped for anything other than her direct benefit. I want it airtight." Valerie's eyebrows rose again, but this time there was admiration in her expression. "We can make that happen." They spent the next 40 minutes drafting the terms. Margaret was meticulous, reviewing each clause like she was fortifying a castle wall. When the transfer was complete, a sum large enough to cover Emily's education and then some, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't anticipated. Not joy exactly, but a deep, settling sense of rightness. As she left the bank, the sunlight had taken on a brighter, almost defiant quality. She stepped into it like stepping into a new skin. Her phone buzzed before she'd even reached the end of the block. She glanced down. Stephen. She let it ring out. Moments later, another buzz, Nicole this time. Then Stephen again. Then a text. "Mom, the bank says there's an issue. Call me right now." Another followed. "Mortgage is due next week. This can't wait." By the time she reached her front steps, there were 8 missed calls and 6 messages. The screen lit up again as she unlocked the door, Stephen's name glowing insistently. She carried the phone into the kitchen, set it on the counter, and stared at it for a long moment. The old Margaret, the one who jumped at every buzz, would have picked it up, her voice already apologizing before the conversation began. But that woman had walked out of the bank with her this morning, and she wasn't coming back. The phone buzzed again. Margaret opened the kitchen drawer and slid it inside, the sound muffled to a faint insect-like hum. She closed the drawer with a soft click, then exhaled, a small, almost playful smile curling at the corner of her mouth. She moved to the kettle, filling it for tea, the tension in her shoulders easing with each step. Outside, the bare branches swayed gently in the breeze, tapping the window like fingers keeping time. She was no longer bracing for the next demand, the next crisis manufactured to pull her in. She was bracing for something else entirely, a long fight perhaps, but one she had already decided she would win. Margaret poured the hot water over the tea leaves, the steam rising like a quiet promise. She didn't need to answer Stephen today, or tomorrow, or ever, if the conversation didn't begin with the respect she was due. She took her cup to the window seat, settling in as the late morning light shifted across the room. The phone in the drawer might ring a dozen more times before the day was out, but she would let it. The sound was no longer a summons. It was background noise. As she sipped, Margaret thought of Emily. One day, her granddaughter would know about the trust account, about the morning at the bank, about the moment Margaret decided she was worth more than the scraps she'd been left. That day would come in its own time. For now, it was enough to know she had taken the first true step. And in that quiet kitchen, with the drawer closed and the phone silent, Margaret felt the deep, steady satisfaction of a woman who had just drawn a line and had no intention of ever stepping back over it. The knock on the door came mid-morning, sharp and deliberate. Margaret was halfway through folding laundry when she glanced out the window and saw Nicole's silver SUV parked at the curb. A moment later, Nicole herself appeared on the porch. Coat belted tight, hair perfectly smooth, sunglasses hiding her eyes. Margaret opened the door just enough to be polite. "Nicole." "Marianne," Nicole said in that syrupy tone that always made Margaret's teeth ache. "We need to talk." "I'm sure you do," Margaret replied, stepping back to let her in. The air between them was taut as they moved into the living room. Nicole didn't waste time. Stephen tells me the bank says you canceled all the transfers. I'm hoping this is some kind of mistake. If something's bothering you, we can work it out. But cutting us off without warning, that's not how families handle things. Margaret met her gaze over the rim of her teacup. I've been more than fair for years. What I'm doing now is setting boundaries. Nicole's lips tightened. You're making things harder than they need to be. Margaret almost laughed. Funny, I was thinking the same about you. The younger woman shifted in her seat, clearly unused to being met with such bluntness. Daniels, she caught herself. Stephen's under a lot of stress. The mortgage is yours, Margaret interrupted. So are the cars, the vacations, and the dinners out. I'm done funding your lifestyle. Nicole's sunglasses slipped just enough for Margaret to see the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. She stood abruptly. This isn't over. I'm sure it isn't, Margaret said calmly, walking her to the door. Nicole's heels clicked sharply on the hardwood as she left, the sound fading down the porch steps. Margaret closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from the strange rush of finally saying no and meaning it. It was only a matter of time before the next knock came. This time, it was Stephen. It was Saturday morning when she saw his SUV pull into the driveway. He came alone, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, the set of his shoulders signaling he was ready for an argument. "Can I come in?" he asked. "You can," Margaret said. "Whether you should is another matter." He stepped inside without comment, glancing around as if expecting the house to look different now that the flow of money had stopped. He dropped into an armchair without waiting to be invited. "All right, Mom, what's going on? The bank says you canceled the transfers. Our mortgage payment bounced yesterday." "I suppose it's good you had money to move around," Margaret replied, settling onto the sofa. Stephen's expression hardened. "Mom, if you were upset about something, you could have told me. This stunt doesn't help anyone." "It helps me," she said evenly. "It helps me remember I'm not your safety net or your ATM." "This is about the other night, isn't it?" Nicole's comment, she was joking. Margaret's laugh was quiet but without humor. "If it were just one night, maybe you'd be right, but it's not. It's years of being treated like my worth is measured only by what I can give you." "You're blowing this out of proportion. We've always appreciated—" "Have you?" she cut in. "When was the last time you called me just to ask how I was? Not because you needed something, just because you cared." His mouth opened, then shut again. She could see him searching for a safe answer and coming up empty. "I'm not saying we've been perfect," he said finally, "but family's supposed to help each other. You taught me that." "And I'm still willing to help when it's needed," Margaret replied. "Needed doesn't mean bailing you out every month because you can't live within your means. It doesn't mean paying for luxuries while I'm told to be more frugal with my own needs." Stephen rubbed his face with both hands. "This is going to put us in a tough spot." "So do I," she said firmly. "Obligations to myself, to my peace of mind. I've spent years putting yours ahead of mine. That ends now." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Stephen stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. At last, he stood. "I think you're making a mistake," he said, heading for the door. "You're right," she replied. "It's my choice." He left without another word, his SUV backing out of the driveway in a spray of gravel. Margaret watched from the doorway, her hands steady at her sides. The air in the house felt different after he was gone, lighter somehow. These confrontations weren't pleasant, but each one was another stake in the ground, marking where her limits now stood, and she intended to keep them exactly where they were. Nicole arrived 2 days later, but this time there was no unannounced knock, just the slow turn of her SUV into the driveway and the deliberate click of her heels on the path. She wore a cream wool coat, a perfect blowout, and that signature smile that never reached her eyes. "Margaret," she said warmly, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "I thought we could clear the air." Margaret gestured toward the living room. "Then let's get to it." Nicole sat, crossing her legs, her voice honey smooth. "I know things have been tense. I don't want us to drift apart over misunderstandings. We're family." Margaret took a measured sip of tea, letting the silence stretch. "We are," she said finally, "which is why I expect respect. Something I haven't been getting." Nicole's smile faltered. "You've always been generous. We've never taken that for granted." "Yes, you have," Margaret said, her voice like cool glass. "Every payment I made, every bill I covered, was met with more expectation and less gratitude." The crack in Nicole's composure deepened. She shifted in her seat. "Stevens, under pressure. You cutting us off, it's punishment." "It's boundaries," Margaret corrected, "and I won't apologize for them." Before Nicole could respond, the conversation was interrupted by a knock. Stephen entered, followed by Nicole's sister, Patricia, and two cousins. The family meeting was already in motion, and by the look of it, the numbers were stacked against her. Patricia took the lead, her tone falsely conciliatory. "Margaret, we're all here because we care. We just think this decision of yours is extreme." Nicole nodded quickly. "We can work this out together." Stephen's gaze was tight with frustration. "Mom, you're going to cause a rift that doesn't need to be there." For a moment, Margaret could feel the air press in. Too many voices, too many faces expecting her to yield. But she stayed seated, her posture straight, her teacup steady. And then, from the far corner of the room, Emily spoke. "Maybe the rift was already there," she said. Her voice was calm but carried easily across the room. "Grandma's just done pretending it's not." Heads turned. Nicole's mouth opened in disbelief. "Emily, no." Emily cut her off. "I'm not going to watch everyone gang up on her because she's finally looking out for herself. She's done more for this family than anyone else in this room, and you all know it." The silence that followed was electric. Even Margaret felt her breath catch, not from surprise at Emily's loyalty, but from the impact of hearing it said aloud. Patricia cleared her throat, but the momentum had shifted. The cousins avoided eye contact. Nicole's eyes darted between faces, looking for support that wasn't there. Stephen tried one last angle. "Emily, this isn't about, it's exactly about respect," Emily said firmly. "And if you can't see that, maybe you should think about why." Margaret set her teacup down with deliberate care. "Thank you, Emily," she said, her voice steady. Then she stood, scanning the room. "I'm glad we had this little gathering. It makes it easier to say this once so everyone hears it. My finances are my own, my decisions are my own, and my boundaries are my own. None of those things are open for discussion." She moved toward the door, the tension in the room almost visible. Nicole half rose, as if to stop her. "Margaret!" Margaret paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorknob. "You can call it selfish if you like. I call it survival. Those are my new rules. Live with them or don't. But they're not changing." And with that, she opened the door and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The wind tugged gently at her scarf, the sunlight falling warm across her face. Behind her, the room buzzed with low voices, but she didn't look back. Each step toward her car felt lighter, freer, as if she'd shed years in the space of a single meeting. She had walked in, surrounded, outnumbered, and expected to bend. Instead, she'd left with the upper hand, and everyone knew it. The morning after the family meeting, Margaret woke to a stillness she hadn't felt in years. No buzzing phone demanding her attention. No urgent messages disguised as quick questions. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of maple leaves outside her window. She lingered in bed a little longer than usual, letting the sunlight creep across her quilt. For decades, she'd been out of bed early, ready to run errands for others, to keep schedules that weren't her own. But now, the day belonged to her. By mid-morning, she was in the garden, wearing her oldest straw hat and kneeling on the damp soil. The roses she'd planted last spring were stubbornly holding on, a few blossoms still catching the last warmth of the season. She pruned with care, thinking about how much attention it took to keep them alive. Not just water and sunlight, but vigilance, watching for signs of disease, cutting away what was dead so the plant could breathe. It struck her how much the work mirrored relationships. Without steady care, they withered. And sometimes you had to cut back the dead branches entirely. When her knees began to protest, she stood and brushed the dirt from her gloves. The air carried a faint chill, but the sun was warm on her back. She filled the bird feeder, smiling as a pair of sparrows darted in to inspect her work before she'd even stepped away. Inside, the answering machine light was blinking. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. It was Janet, her oldest friend, inviting her to join the local book club meeting that evening. "They're reading that mystery you liked last year," Janet's voice said. "You'd be perfect for the discussion." Margaret hadn't been to a book club in years. Most evenings had been spent babysitting, running errands, or simply too tired from the day's demands. She called Janet back immediately. "Count me in." That night, she arrived at the library's community room to find a circle of women. Some old friends, some strangers, chatting over cups of tea. Janet waved her over, introducing her with a proud smile. "This is Margaret. She's the one who got me hooked on crime novels." The hour passed in lively conversation, debating plot twists and favorite characters. Margaret found herself laughing, really laughing, at a particularly outlandish theory from one of the members. It had been too long since she'd felt this light. Over the next week, she began shaping a new rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons at the community center library, where she volunteered to help with book donations and reading programs for children. She learned the names of the regulars: Mr. Atkins, who always asked for large print mysteries; Lisa, the young mother who brought her toddler to story time every Thursday. One afternoon, she stayed late to help sort a delivery of donated books. As she shelved them, she realized how much she enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of work that served no agenda, but her own sense of purpose. No one here asked for loans or favors. No one expected her to fix their mistakes. Her only currency was her time and attention, and it felt like wealth. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals for herself: roasted vegetables, fresh bread from the bakery, the occasional indulgence of a rich stew. She took her dinner by the kitchen window, watching the sun dip behind the trees, the sky shifting from gold to indigo. The phone still rang some nights, Stephen's number appearing on the screen, but she let it go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to invite that noise back in. One Saturday, she attended a community gardening workshop at the park. She learned about composting, met a retired botanist who shared tips on soil health, and left with a tray of herb seedlings. Back home, she planted them in a sunny corner of the yard, imagining how they'd grow into fragrant clusters by spring. It wasn't just the activities that filled her days, it was the absence of constant demands, the mental space to think about what she wanted, to make choices without the weight of obligation. And in that space, she began to feel something she hadn't in years: ownership of her own life. On Sunday afternoon, Emily dropped by unexpectedly, a bakery bag in hand. "From that place you love," she said, pulling out 2 still-warm apple turnovers. They ate at the kitchen table, talking about Emily's classes, her new part-time job at the bookstore, and her plans for college. "They're not happy with me," Emily admitted, for not taking sides. "But I told them I was. Yours." Margaret reached across the table, squeezing her granddaughter's hand. "I'm not asking you to choose. You shouldn't have to." "I know," Emily said. "But you're the only one treating me like I can think for myself, and I don't like how they talk about you." "People talk," Margaret said gently. "They always will. The important thing is that you know the truth, and I know the truth. That's enough." Emily smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Margaret could see the weight she was carrying, stuck between loyalty to her parents and respect for her grandmother. She didn't want Emily to carry it forever. After Emily left, Margaret stepped into the garden. The late afternoon light was soft, casting long shadows across the yard. She inhaled deeply, the scent of earth and roses filling her lungs. This was her sanctuary now, not a retreat from the world, but a space she'd chosen for herself. The days ahead might still bring tension. Stephen and Nicole weren't likely to give up trying to reclaim the control they'd lost. But for now, Margaret had something far more valuable than their approval, a life that was hers and hers alone. Margaret's calendar had begun to look like her own life story, finally written in her handwriting. Monday mornings were for gardening, Tuesdays the community library, and now Wednesdays had a new addition, an art class at the local recreation center. She hadn't painted in decades, not since she was a young woman with a toddler tugging at her hem and a kitchen full of bills on the counter. But when she stood before the easel that first day, brush in hand, she felt something in her chest loosen. The class was small, half a dozen students of various ages, and the instructor, a cheerful woman named Sandra, encouraged them to paint for themselves, not for the wall. Margaret took to it immediately, her strokes hesitant at first, then surer, her landscape slowly filling with color and light. By Thursday evening, she was at the book club, this time not just listening, but leading discussions. She recommended titles, suggested themes, and found herself lingering afterward for tea with a few of the other members. These were connections she hadn't had time to nurture before, friendships formed not out of obligation but out of shared joy. One sunny Friday, she was tending her roses when Mrs. Delgado, the president of the neighborhood council, stopped at the gate. "Margaret," she called, "have you ever thought about joining the community board? We need someone with a level head and a bit of backbone." Margaret laughed, brushing soil from her gloves. "And you think that's me?" "I think that's exactly you," Mrs. Delgado replied. "Everyone knows you're not afraid to speak your mind." It was the first time in a long while that someone had valued her decisiveness instead of resenting it. She accepted the invitation, and by the following week she was sitting in a meeting room with 6 other board members, discussing everything from park maintenance to neighborhood safety. Her voice carried weight here. People listened. They didn't interrupt, they didn't roll their eyes, and they certainly didn't dismiss her ideas. But peace, Margaret had learned, was rarely unbroken for long. One afternoon, during a coffee break after the council meeting, she overheard 2 neighbors whispering near the refreshment table. "Nicole says her mother-in-law's been acting strange," one said. "Not herself lately," the other replied in a low voice. "Sounds like she's, not thinking clearly." Margaret froze mid-step, the paper cup in her hand trembling slightly. She didn't need to ask who they meant. Nicole had found a new tactic. If she couldn't guilt Margaret back into line, she'd try to discredit her. The familiar tightness returned to Margaret's chest, the one she'd felt so many times before when words were used as weapons in polite tones. But this time, she wasn't the same woman who swallowed it in silence. She didn't confront the neighbors in that moment. Instead, she walked back to the table, smiling faintly, and poured herself another coffee. Inside, however, her mind was already turning over a plan. 2 days later, at the monthly community gathering, Margaret arrived early and took her seat near the front. The hall was full. Residents, local shop owners, even the high school principal. She had been asked to speak about the council's plans for the new community garden, and she decided to take the opportunity for more than just plant talk. When her turn came, she stood at the podium, her voice steady but warm. "This neighborhood has been my home for over 30 years. I've seen us weather storms, both the kind that come from the sky and the kind that come from misunderstandings between people." She let her gaze sweep the room, meeting eyes without flinching. "Recently, I've heard a few whispers suggesting I might not be as sharp as I used to be. I'd like to thank those people for their concern, but let me assure you, my mind is as clear as it's ever been, and I intend to use it, here, in service of this community. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some embarrassed, others nodding in support. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. If anyone doubts my capacity, they're welcome to join me next week when I present our budget proposal to the City Council. I'll be happy to walk them through every line item. Laughter and applause followed, the kind that comes from an audience that knows exactly what's being addressed, without anyone needing to name names. After the meeting, several neighbors approached her. Mrs. Kim from the bakery, Mr. Harris from the hardware store, even the principal, each offering words of respect. "It's good to see someone standing up to gossip," Mr. Harris said, shaking her hand firmly. Margaret felt the tension ease from her shoulders. Nicole's attempt had backfired. The very network Nicole had tried to poison was now reinforced with stronger ties, forged in public respect. That evening, as she watered her herbs in the fading light, Margaret realized something important. She no longer feared what people might say about her. She'd built a place for herself outside of the narrow world Stephen and Nicole tried to keep her in, a place where her voice mattered and her worth wasn't measured in checks, written, or favors done. And the more she invested in that world, the smaller and more irrelevant their influence became. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in her head. Once you plant yourself in good soil, you don't need to beg for sunlight. Margaret looked around her garden, the herbs thriving, the roses she'd tended for months blooming stubbornly against the autumn chill, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. Her life was no longer about surviving the next demand or enduring the next slight. It was about choosing where to give her time, her care, her voice, and she was choosing well. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped quietly through the mail slot between a gardening catalog and the electric bill. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. Stephen's, neat but slightly cramped, the way it had been since his school days. She stood for a moment in the hallway, the envelope resting in her palm. Part of her wanted to set it aside, to leave it unopened on the counter until she felt ready. But curiosity outweighed hesitation. She fetched her letter opener and slit the top cleanly. "Mom," the letter began, "I'm sorry. I can see now that we've been taking too much from you without giving enough back. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you're feeling, but I want to try. If you're willing, I'd like to visit, just me, no Nicole, and talk. No money, no requests, just a conversation." Margaret read it twice, her thumb brushing the edge of the paper. She felt no immediate rush of forgiveness, but there was something in the tone, less defensive, more human, than she'd heard from him in years. 2 days later, Stephen arrived. He was dressed simply, jeans, a navy sweater, and carried nothing but his keys and a folded piece of paper. His face looked tired, the faint lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly at the door. Margaret stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared countless breakfasts when he was a boy, where he'd done his homework, where she'd paid bills for both of them more times than she could count. Stephen cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what you said, about boundaries, about respect. I can't change the past, but I don't want the rest of our time together to be defined by those mistakes." Margaret listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. "I know I let Nicole's attitude influence me," he continued. "I should have spoken up when she was out of line. I didn't. And I should have been the one making sure you felt appreciated. I wasn't." The apology was not perfect, but it was his, and it was unaccompanied by excuses. That alone felt like progress. "Stephen," she said after a pause, "I'm willing to have a relationship with you, but it has to be on different terms. My boundaries aren't going to vanish because we share blood. If you can respect them, we can move forward. If not, then we'll keep our distance." He nodded slowly. "I can try." Margaret's eyes softened just a fraction. Trying is a start. They talked for nearly an hour, moving from heavier topics into lighter ones. His work, Emily's plans for college, even a few stories about George that made them both smile. There were no requests for help, no subtle hints at financial trouble, just conversation, tentative but genuine. As Stephen prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. I know I can't fix everything overnight, but thank you for giving me the chance to start. Margaret simply nodded. We'll see where this goes. She watched from the window as he walked to his car, his steps unhurried. For the first time in a long while, she felt there might be a path forward, not a return to what had been, but the beginning of something new, something healthier. After he drove away, the house settled back into its familiar quiet. Margaret brewed herself a cup of tea and carried it out to the garden. The late afternoon sun lay golden across the grass, catching the edges of the roses still in bloom. She took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through her. Her life now was measured not by how much she gave away, but by how fully she chose to live it. And she had no intention of surrendering that. The future wasn't certain. Nicole might try again. Old habits could resurface. But Margaret knew she had the strength, and now the will, to stand her ground. For the moment, that was enough. She glanced toward the gate, where a neighbor was walking past with her dog, and raised a hand in greeting. The world beyond her fence no longer felt like a place to be wary of, but one to step into on her own terms. In the quiet hum of the evening, Margaret realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she intended to keep it that way however many years she had left. The path ahead was hers, and hers alone. Emily showed up on a breezy Saturday morning with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a determined look in her eyes. Is it okay if I stay here for a while, Grandma? She asked, standing in the doorway like she was bracing for refusal. Mom and we're not seeing eye to eye. Margaret stepped aside without hesitation. You don't have to ask twice. Emily's presence shifted the whole house. Mornings began with the two of them sharing coffee, Margaret with her tea, Emily with her oversized mug of hot chocolate, while the smell of toast drifted through the kitchen. They cooked dinner together, sometimes experimenting with recipes, sometimes just making pancakes at odd hours because they felt like it. Evenings were quieter but warmer. Margaret reading in her chair while Emily sprawled on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through her phone or sketching in her notebook. The house, which had so often been silent, now held the soft rhythm of two people, simply enjoying each other's company. The change was visible in Margaret's face, less tension in her brow, more ease in her smile. And for Emily, there was a lightness too, as if she'd stepped out from under a constant shadow. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons, when they were in the garden planting herbs, that Margaret saw a familiar SUV turn into the driveway. Stephen, alone. Emily froze mid-scoop of soil. Do you want me to go inside? No, Margaret said firmly. You stay. This is your home right now. Stephen approached slowly, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. Hi, Mom, he said, his voice softer than she expected. His gaze flicked briefly to Emily, then back to her. Can we talk? Margaret straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. We can. They moved to the porch, Emily close enough to hear but not intrude. Stephen didn't waste time. I know I've been blind. I let things slide that I shouldn't have. I didn't stand up for you when Nicole crossed the line, and I leaned on you more than I had any right to. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, heavier than they looked. I'm not here to ask for anything, he added quickly. I just want to start fixing what I broke. For a moment, Margaret felt something stir. Relief, maybe, or the faint outline of hope. But she also knew how easy it was to fall back into old patterns. Stephen, she said carefully, I've heard apologies before. What I haven't seen is change. Words are easy. Actions are what matter. He nodded. I know. I'm ready to show you. Her eyes searched his, looking for the familiar signs. Defensiveness, calculation, the quick pivot to excuses, but they weren't there. Still, she kept her guard up. "I won't go back to how things were," she said. "The money stays where it is. The boundaries stay in place. If that's a problem, this conversation ends now." "It's not a problem," he said quickly. "If anything, I think it's overdue." The sincerity in his tone was disarming, but Margaret reminded herself that sincerity could fade under pressure. She would give him the chance to prove himself, but not the power to hurt her again. Emily, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Dad, if you mean it, then you have to respect Grandma the way you'd want me to respect you. No more taking advantage. No more pretending things are fine when they're not." Stephen looked at her, his expression tightening just a little, then softening. "You're right." They talked for another half hour, about Emily's plans, about the garden, about memories of George. It felt strange, like walking on a new bridge built over a river that had nearly swept them apart. When Stephen left, Margaret watched him drive away with mixed emotions. There was no neat resolution, no sudden rush of trust, but there was space now, space where something better could grow if both sides tended it. That night, Margaret and Emily curled up on the couch to watch an old movie, sharing a bowl of popcorn. Halfway through, Emily leaned her head against Margaret's shoulder. "I'm glad I'm here," she murmured. Margaret smiled, resting her cheek lightly against her granddaughter's hair. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." As the credits rolled, Margaret realized that whatever happened next, with Stephen, with Nicole, with the family at large, she had already won something more important than any argument. She had created a life where respect was the rule, not the exception. And for the first time in decades, she wasn't standing her ground out of fear of losing something. She was standing her ground because she knew exactly what she wanted to protect. The road ahead might still twist and turn, but Margaret was ready. She had her home, her garden, her friends, and most of all, she had Emily. Living proof that love could survive even when old loyalties cracked. She didn't need anyone's permission to keep going. She already was.